$47. That's the labor cost baked into a pair of Nikes that retails for $150 in the United States. And almost none of that $47 stays in America. Most of it flows to a country Nike has spent 30 years trying to control and now cannot leave. The question driving this whole story is a simple one. How does a company get so deep into a single country that exit becomes more expensive than staying, no matter what happens politically, economically, or reputationally? Vietnam is where that answer lives. By 2024, roughly 50% of every Nike shoe made on Earth comes out of Vietnamese factories. That's around 240 million pairs a year, built by 300,000 workers earning somewhere between $250 and $350 a month. The factories run 12-hour shifts. The shoes sell for $150, and Nike, the most valuable sportswear brand in history, cannot move. If you want to know how a company that's sophisticated ends up trapped by its own supply chain, stick around, because subscribing is the only way you'll see exactly how it happened. To understand how that lock-in happened, you have to go back to the moment Nike made a bet that seemed obvious at the time and turned out to be a trap they built themselves. In the early 1990s, Vietnam was just opening. The Doi Moi reforms cracked the door to foreign investment in 1991, and Nike walked through it almost immediately, setting up pilot factories in the Ho Chi Minh City region. The appeal was straightforward. Vietnamese labor cost around 20 cents an hour at a time when Indonesian workers were earning 80 cents. Nike's manufacturing was already outsourced across South Korea, Taiwan, and Indonesia, so Vietnam looked like the next rung down the cost ladder. Cheap, available, and politically willing. By the mid-1990s, Nike had scaled to 30-plus factories across the country. Vietnam became the second-largest manufacturing base in the Nike system, behind Indonesia, and then the exposés started. Between 1997 and 2001, the New York Times, CBS's 60 Minutes, and a documentary called The Big One put Nike's Vietnamese factories on front pages and primetime television. The allegations covered poor conditions, wage violations, and child labor. Nike's public response was to establish a code of conduct, bring in external auditors, and pledge transparency. The private response was different. They stayed. They deepened. Labor researcher Thuyen Nguyen spent 2 decades inside those factories conducting interviews with workers. Her conclusion was blunt. The audits didn't change the factories. They changed what the factories told auditors. Speed-up quotas, wage theft, and retaliation against union organizers continued through the audit era and beyond. Nike's compliance machinery produced reports, the factories produced shoes, and Nike kept building. Between 2001 and 2010, Nike and its contract manufacturers poured roughly $2 billion into Vietnamese supply chain infrastructure. The key contractors, Phu Chen Group, Yuen Industrial, and Panda International, are Taiwanese and South Korean firms that followed Nike into Vietnam and built their own empires there. Phu Chen alone now generates $9.2 billion in annual revenue, with Nike representing somewhere between 35% and 40% of that total. That's roughly $3 billion a year flowing from Nike to a single contractor. Those are not relationships you unwind over a conference call. By 2010, Vietnam had become Nike's single largest manufacturing country, accounting for roughly 40% of footwear. The supplier ecosystem had matured into something genuinely difficult to replicate. Specialized pattern makers, last designers, quality control protocols refined over a decade of Nike-specific production. That expertise didn't exist anywhere else at scale, and crucially, the Vietnamese government understood exactly what it had. Tariff exemptions, tax holidays, and infrastructure subsidies worth an estimated $200 to $400 million annually were already flowing to Nike's supply chain by this point. Not out of generosity, but out of calculated dependency. Hanoi needed Nike's 300,000 jobs. Nike needed Hanoi's cooperation. The relationship had become bilateral in a way the original cost ladder logic never anticipated. Then the financial crisis hit, and Nike faced a real choice. In 2008 and 2009, with global demand collapsing and every cost line under scrutiny, Nike's supply chain team modeled what it would cost to reduce Vietnam exposure and diversify toward other countries. The number that came back stopped the conversation. Relocating even a fraction of Vietnamese production would cost between $500 million and $1 billion, and take years to execute without destroying product quality in the transition. Vietnam's labor costs were still 30 to 40% below the next cheapest alternative. Nike chose to go deeper instead of out. That decision in 2008 and 2009 is the actual inflection point of this story. Every constraint Nike operates under today traces back to that moment when the math said stay, and the company listened. Consider what the math was actually measuring. A Vietnamese footwear worker earning $300 a month versus an Indonesian worker earning $475 a month sounds like a modest gap until you multiply it across 300,000 workers for 12 months. The annual savings land somewhere between $600 million and $1.2 billion compared to the next cheapest alternative. That figure, repeated every single year, is what made the sunk cost rational. Every year Nike stayed, the savings compounded, and the exit cost grew. The trap wasn't a mistake, it was arithmetic. By 2015, the lock-in was structural in every dimension simultaneously. Worker training, logistics networks, port infrastructure, and supplier relationships had all been optimized specifically for Nike's production requirements. The Vietnamese footwear industry as a whole was generating $24 billion in annual exports, with Nike accounting for roughly 20 to 25% of that total. Nike was no longer just a customer in Vietnam. It was a load-bearing wall of the national economy, and load-bearing walls are not things governments let foreign companies walk away from quietly. Then came the tariff threats. When the Trump administration began signaling tariffs on Vietnamese goods in 2016 and 2017, Nike's supply chain team ran the numbers again. Moving 20% of production to Thailand, Indonesia, or India would take 3 to 5 years and cost over $300 million in transition expenses alone, before accounting for quality losses during the ramp-up period. New factories in a new country typically see defect rates 8 to 15% higher than mature facilities during their first years of operation. On 200 million pairs of shoes, a 10% defect increase means 20 million pairs with quality problems. At a manufacturing cost of $47 per pair, that's nearly $1 billion in scrap and rework before a single tariff dollar gets paid. Nike explored the alternatives. It stayed in Vietnam. COVID-19 in 2020 was supposed to be the forcing function. Vietnam's strict lockdowns shut factories for months, and Nike's production exposure was suddenly visible in a way it hadn't been before. Revenue dropped. Shelves went empty. Investors asked the obvious question, why is so much of this company sitting in one country? The honest answer, which Nike's investor communications danced around without quite saying, was that the concentration existed because concentration had been cheaper than diversification for 30 consecutive years. And the bill for that choice was now arriving in the form of empty store shelves rather than a line item on a balance sheet. John Donahoe, who took the CEO role in 2020, committed to investing in automation and what he called reducing labor dependency over the long term, while confirming that Vietnam would remain a key manufacturing hub. The language was careful. The commitment was not. Automation in footwear manufacturing is genuinely difficult because shoe assembly involves irregular materials, complex three-dimensional geometry, and tactile quality checks that industrial robots handle poorly at scale. The automation pivot is real as a long-term direction. As a near-term exit strategy from Vietnam, it is a decade away at minimum. Here's what the exit cost actually looks like today. Building new factory capacity to replace 240 million pairs annually in a different country would require somewhere between $2 and $4 billion in construction and equipment alone. Training workers to Nike's quality specifications in a new country would take 18 to 36 months per facility. The sunk assets already in Vietnam, factories, equipment, logistics networks, represent $8 to $12 billion of invested capital that would effectively be abandoned. And walking away from Pu Chen's $3 billion annual contract would trigger cascading failures across the sub-supplier network, damaging relationships with a contractor that also supplies Adidas, New Balance, and ASICS. That kind of supply chain rupture doesn't stay contained to Nike. The reputational exposure runs in the other direction too. Nike has absorbed over $1.5 billion in cumulative labor rights litigation and settlements since the 1990s, much of it centered on Vietnam. Abruptly abandoning 300,000 Vietnamese workers would generate a new wave of class action exposure, estimated at $200 to $500 million, plus NGO campaigns that have historically cost the brand between $1 and $300 million in equity damage per cycle. Human Rights Watch and the International Labour Organization have both maintained active monitoring programs in Vietnamese Nike facilities for over 2 decades. Those organizations would not treat a sudden exit as a humanitarian gesture. Staying is expensive. Leaving is more expensive. That's the trap. Mark Parker, who ran Nike from 2006 through 2020, framed it the way executives frame things when the real answer is uncomfortable. The commitment was to fix Vietnam, not leave it. Reform as competitive advantage, labor compliance as a cost of doing business rather than a reason to change the business. Parker oversaw a period in which Nike's Vietnamese workforce grew, wages rose modestly in nominal terms, and the structural dependency deepened every year. The factories got better audits. The wages stayed low relative to the retail price of what workers were producing. The dependency deepened. Kathy Lee Gifford had made this exact point from a different angle back in the late 1990s, when her own apparel brand was caught up in a sweatshop scandal in Honduras, and she became one of the most visible critics of the entire outsourced manufacturing model. Her argument was simple. Once you know, you can't unknow it. Nike knew what its Vietnamese factories looked like by 1997 at the latest. The knowledge didn't change the economics. The economics were the point. What Nike built in Vietnam over 30 years is not a manufacturing relationship, it's a monoculture. A single country producing half the world's supply of the most valuable sneaker brand on earth, with no realistic alternative at scale, no exit that doesn't cost more than the problem it solves, and a workforce earning roughly $1.50 an hour to produce something that sells for 100 times that in American retail. Some reporting from 2022 and 2023 suggests Nike is quietly exploring India and Indonesia for 10 to 15% of new capacity additions, not as a replacement for Vietnam, but as a hedge against the next lockdown or the next tariff threat. India's footwear manufacturing sector has been growing, and the Indian government has been actively courting Nike with its own package of incentives. But India's current capacity for the kind of complex athletic footwear Nike produces at volume is a fraction of Vietnam's. Building it up to meaningful scale takes the same 5 to 7 years and the same billion-dollar investment that every other alternative has required. The hedge is real. The replacement is not. The story of Nike and Vietnam is usually told as a labor story, and the labor story is real. 300,000 workers, 12-hour shifts, $250 a month, $1.50 of labor in a $150 shoe. Those numbers are not abstractions. They are the daily condition of the people who make the product. But the deeper structural story is about how a company optimized so aggressively for cost that it built itself a prison out of its own savings. Every dollar Nike didn't spend on wages became a dollar invested in infrastructure that made leaving harder. Every year of deepening supplier relationships added another layer of exit cost. Every government subsidy accepted was a future obligation incurred. The efficiency was real, so is the lock-in. Phil Knight built Nike on the idea that manufacturing was someone else's problem. Outsource the factories, own the brand, capture the margin in between. What the model didn't account for was that 30 years of outsourcing to the same place, at the same scale, with the same contractors, turns the factory into your problem whether you own it or not. The brand is Nike's. The dependency is also Nike's. And the workers earning $1.50 an hour to produce $150 shoes are embedded in a system that neither Nike's audits, nor Nike's automation roadmap, nor Nike's India hedging strategy has any realistic near-term plan to change. Vietnam isn't Nike's factory. Vietnam is Nike's dependency, and dependencies, once structural, don't get unwound. They get managed, hedged, and quietly lived with, while the shoes keep shipping and the quarterly reports keep landing and the exit cost keeps growing every year. Nike stays. Nike can't leave Vietnam. The more honest version is that Nike spent 3 decades making sure it couldn't. One factory, one contractor relationship, one government subsidy at a time, and called it a supply chain strategy the whole way through.